இப்போ வந்து ஸ்ப்ரிங் பூட் டெக் ஆர்க் லெவல் கொஷின்ஸ். ஹவ் ஆர் மோர் அட்வான்ஸ்டு ஸ்ப்ரிங் பூட் ஹியர் ஆர் சம் மோர் அட்வான்ஸ்டு ஸ்ப்ரிங் பூட் இன்டர்வியூ கொஷின்ஸ் tailored for the technology architect. How do you design a microservice architecture with the Spring Boot? By using the Spring Boot for individual services, Spring Cloud for coordination, and considering the scalability and then resilience and independent deployment. How would you handle the eventual consistency in the Spring Boot microservices architecture? Through asynchronous communication with the messaging queue like RabbitQ, RabbitMQ, Kafka, or implementing the Saga patterns, we can eventually implement the microservices. Consistency, okay. What is the circuit breaker pattern, and how do you implement in the Spring Boot? It prevents the cascading failure using the Spring Cloud circuit breaker or the Resilience 4J. Prevent the cascading. Okay, it prevents this cascading failures specifically. Okay. And then how would you scale the Spring Boot application horizontally? By using the containerization Docker or Kubernetes for orchestration, and Spring Boot is stateless design for scalability. Or is scale, okay. Kubernetes we can through, yeah. And then how would you manage the distributed transactions in the Spring Boot microservices? Distributed transactions பத்தி கேக்குறாங்க. So by using the patterns like Sagad event driven approach. Okay. And what are the different communication mechanism in the Spring Boot for the microservices? REST, Kafka, gRPC, and so on. Okay. REST API messaging service like Kafka. These are what is that? Different communication mechanisms. Okay. And how do you implement the service discovery? Service discovery பத்தி கேக்குறான். So using the Netflix Eureka or Console for dynamic registration and discovery services. Using cloud Netflix Eureka or Console. How would you handle the configuration management across the multiple environment by using the Spring Cloud config? Spring Cloud config server, externalized configuration, and then version control. Okay, that has a version control as well. Okay, and how do you ensure high availability in the Spring Boot microservices? By using the load balancing and then discovery, circuit break, and then clustering. இதெல்லாம் வச்சு high availability வந்து பண்ணலாம். Basically, keep the server in multiple region. What is reactive programming and how does the Spring Boot support it? Spring Webflux provides the non-blocking reactive code. Okay. It is suitable for handling the large number of concurrent requests. Non-blocking, asynchronous background operation. How would you design a robust logging system in a Spring Boot microservices by using the centralized logging like Elk, Lagstash, Kibana, Banana, Spring Cloud Slash, and then Zipskin? By using all of this, we can able to do that. Okay. How do you secure the distributed Spring Boot microservices? OAuth 2 and then JWT token and then Spring security. By using all of this, we can able to provide the security. This I know. How do you handle large data sets efficiently in the Spring Boot? Large data set efficiently in the Spring Boot by using the pagination, batching, leveraging the database optimization technique like indexing. Okay. Excellent question. How would you integrate the Spring Boot with the NoSQL databases like MongoDB or DynamoDB by using the Spring Boot data, Spring Boot data, MongoDB or the Spring data, DynamoDB for seamless integration with the NoSQL bench. Okay, NoSQL database. Local setup பண்றதுக்கு வந்து NoSQL bench. Okay. What consideration would you take for design the multi-tenant Spring Boot application? It should be multi-tenant. How will you do? Database sharding, schema separation, and then tenant context management for the data isolation. Multiple tenant வந்து data இருக்கும் okay. And then sync up ஆகும் okay. How would you design a distributed ski caching mechanism in the Spring Boot application using Redis or the Memcache with the Spring Boot caching abstraction and considering cache eviction strategies by using that cache mechanism வந்து implement பண்ணலாம். Memcache Redis caching abstraction and then consideration. What are the key factors in the designing the fault tolerant in the Spring Boot application? Fault tolerant in the Spring Boot application: circuit break, retires, bulkheads, and then no fallback mechanism with the tools like resilience 4j and so on. Using these factors we can able to design fault tolerant. How do you design the for scalability in the cloud native Spring Boot application? Cloud native Spring Boot application scalability கேக்குறாங்க. Okay. Scalability நாவே வந்து by leveraging the cloud native services like AWS Lambda, auto scaling policies. By using that, we can able to scale the packages. Okay, I mean application. What is the difference between monolithic and then microservices architecture? மோனாலித்திக்கும் இதுக்கும் என்ன டிஃபரன்ஸ்? மோனாலித்திக்ஸ் ஆர் வந்து சிங்கிள் யூனிஃபைடு சிஸ்டம், while microservices வந்து break functionality into independent deployable services. Single unified system இது வந்து break into multiple functionality independently we can deploy the services. Okay. How do you optimize the performance பத்தி பேசலாம். So in the Spring Boot application, by using the cache, lazy loading, optimizing the database queries, asynchronous processing, by using all of this, we can achieve that. How do you manage the state in the stateless Spring Boot microservices architecture? Stateless means using the external system like Redis or the databases to maintain the state information. I mean, caching them. How do you handle the request throttling? Number of requests, right? Throttling. So by implementing the rate limit filters using the API like Bucket4j or custom throttling logic. Bucket throttling வந்து control பண்ணணும். How would you implement the API versioning in Spring Boot microservices through URI versioning, query parameters, or header based versioning? By using that, we can implement the Spring Boot API versions. API versioning. How do you implement observability in the Spring Boot? Observability microservices அப்படின்னா stream operation நினைக்கிறேன். By integrating with the monitor tools like Prometheus, Grafana micrometer for metrics. Okay. Observability na metrics பத்தி பேசுறான். Okay. How do you handle the database sharding in the Spring Boot? Through database partitioning strategies and then managing shared databases with the Spring Boot data abstractions. How would you implement the blue-green deployment in the Spring Boot? By deploying the new version alongside the existing one and switching traffic to the new version gradually. Oh, new versionக்கு gradually move பண்ணா அதுக்கு பேர் வந்து blue-green deployment. Subset of users வந்து அதை யூஸ் பண்ணுவாங்க. Okay. How do you design for zero downtime deployments in Spring Boot application? Zero downtime deployment. Okay. Using the container orchestration, Kubernetes, rolling updates, and then database migration with Flyway, Liquibase. Using this, we can design the zero downtime deployment. How do you secure the Spring Boot applications at the API gateway level? By implementing the authentication and then authorization mechanism at the gateway using OAuth 2 and then the API gateway level protection. How do you configure distributed tracing in the Spring Boot application? Distributed tracing using Spring Cloud slash and Zipkin for tracing calls across microservices. Okay. How do you implement a continuous integration, continuous deployment for Spring Boot application? Okay, this is simple. By using the Jenkins GitHub Actions or AWS code pipeline with containerized environment and automated testing. How do you mitigate latency issues in the distributed Spring Boot? Latency issues. லேட்டன்சி இஷ்யூஸ் அப்படின்னாவே வந்து டைம் ஆகுது. அதுக்கு பதிலா கேஷிங் அசிங்க்ரனைஸ் கால் ரெடியூசிங் த கிராஸ் சர்வீஸ் கம்யூனிகேஷன் wherever it is possible. And then how would design a resilient Spring Boot application that handles sudden traffic spikes? Resilient is okay. Auto scaling, load balancing, and then implementing the back pressure techniques. So okay, how do you handle the batch processing in the Spring Boot? Spring Batch for managing the large volume batch jobs with the retry and then scheduling mechanism. How do you secure inter-service communication in the Spring Boot? Inter-service communication அப்படின்னா வந்து by using the mutual TLS or OAuth2 token for service to service authentication. Okay, machine to machine communication. How do you design an event-driven architecture using the Spring Boot? By leveraging the Spring Cloud stream with the message broker like a event-driven architecture. Event-driven architecture என்னவே Kafka streaming process. Kafka, RabbitQ, decoupled asynchronous communications இதெல்லாமே வருது. How do you handle the concurrency in the Spring Boot application? By using the synchronized concurrency, optimistic, pessimistic thread management techniques. What is the service mesh? How would you implement in the Spring Boot? Service mesh manage service to service communication. One service communicate with another service, providing observability and then security. How do you manage schema evaluation in the Spring Boot application? Schema evaluation by using the Flyway or Liquid base for the database versioning and then schema migration. Okay. How do you implement the request aggregation in the Spring Boot? Request aggregation பத்தி கேக்குறாங்க. Request aggregation. So இதில் வந்து by using the API gateway pattern to aggregate the multiple microservices responses into a single result. Request aggregation. Okay, multiple request வந்து ஒரு response வரணும். Okay, how would you handle the long running task in the Spring Boot application? By offloading the task background jobs using the queue, RabbitQ or Kafka, or scheduling the frames like quads. By using that long running process we can handle it. How would you integrate the cloud services AWS GCP with the Spring Boot? By using the Spring Cloud AWS SDKs. Through SDKs we can able to implement services like S3, EC2 and then BigQuery. What is the role of circuit breaker in the distributed system? Distributed system circuit breaker என்ன பண்ணுது? How do you implement in the Spring Boot? A circuit breaker protects the services from cascading the failure. Cascading failures வந்து protect பண்ணுது. We are using the resilience 4J. How would you handle the distributed sessions in the Spring Boot microservices architecture? Using Spring session with the external storage like Redis. Redis use பண்ணி distributed system session வந்து handle பண்ணலாம். Okay. நிறைய எதுக்கு Redis வந்து யூஸ் பண்றாங்க. You need to keep remember. How do you implement the API gateway in the Spring Boot microservice? Using Spring Cloud Gateway or the Netflix Zool for the routing and then filtering. How would you design a scalable, scalable fault tolerant message system? They're asking about message system by leveraging the message brokers like Kafka or RabbitQ, ensuring the persistence and retry mechanism. What is the role of service registry in the microservices, and how do you implement it in the Spring Boot? It tracks the service instances. It tracks the service instances implemented using the Spring Cloud, Netflix, Carousel. Okay. How do you handle the failover in the Spring Boot microservices? How do you handle the failover? By setting up the multiple instances with the load balancing and ensuring that the critical services have replicas. How do you implement the request validation in the Spring Boot REST API? At valid custom validator. How do you design the multi-region Spring Boot application? Multi-region Spring Boot deployment. By replicating the application across a region with the load balancer, handling data synchronization, and then failover. What is canary deployment and how do you implement it in the Spring Boot application? A gradual release technique. Gradual release technique. New versions are deployed to a subset of users before rollout. New versions will be deployed for a subset of users before full rollout. That's all.